London, January 1547. The once mighty Lion of England, King Henry VIII, lies sprawled on a bed of crimson silk inside Whitehall Palace. But the sight is far from regal. His swollen legs ooze pus, his breath reeks of decay, and beneath his enormous bulk, the sheets are stained with fluids no servant dares describe. The stench of death clings to the chamber, so thick that courtiers whisper of a curse. Doctors stand helpless, wringing their hands as the king's ulcers burst and rot spreads through his body. The man who executed wives, dissolved monasteries, and reshaped England with fire and sword, is now rotting alive, imprisoned in his own monstrous flesh. And yet, even in these final days, Henry still strikes terror into those who serve him. His temper is sharp, his orders ruthless, and his paranoia unrelenting. He fears betrayal from every shadow, haunted by the ghosts of the very wives and enemies he condemned to death. How did England's most infamous king descend into such misery? What dark choices, bloody deeds, and cursed wounds led Henry VIII to die in such horror, gasping, stinking, and terrified of damnation? Tonight, on Royal Conspiracies, we uncover the horrific final days of King Henry VIII, a story of gluttony, vengeance, and slow decay that ended with the king rotting alive in his own stench. But before we dive deeper into this dark chapter of royal history, welcome to Royal Conspiracies, the channel where we reveal the hidden scandals, bloody secrets, and haunting truths of kings and queens throughout history. If you love gripping historical stories told with raw drama, make sure you subscribe, hit the like button, and share this video with fellow history lovers. Now, let's journey back to the last, terrible days of King Henry VIII. By 1546, Henry VIII was no longer the dashing prince who once jousted in tournaments and charmed Europe's courts. At just 55 years old, he looked decades older. Years of overindulgence, gout, and injuries had twisted his once athletic frame into a bloated, grotesque body weighing nearly 400 pounds. The turning point came in January 1536, when Henry suffered a brutal accident while jousting at Greenwich. His horse fell upon him, leaving him unconscious for hours. His leg was shattered, and from then on, ulcers plagued him. These wounds never healed, festering and oozing infection for the rest of his life. Courtiers spoke in whispers of the unbearable smell that followed the king wherever he went. But Henry's physical decay was only part of the nightmare. His soul, too, seemed consumed by bitterness and rage. Over 3 decades on the throne, he had beheaded 2 wives, Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, executed trusted advisors like Thomas More, and sent thousands to the scaffold in pursuit of power. By his final year, he was haunted by fear. Paranoia became his companion. He trusted no one completely, not his counselors, not his family, not even his surviving wife, Catherine Parr. He saw plots everywhere: Catholic sympathizers, Protestant reformers, foreign agents, even whispers of treachery among his own children's supporters. England itself was unsettled. The break with Rome, the dissolution of monasteries, and the bloodshed of the Pilgrimage of Grace had left deep scars. Europe watched Henry like vultures circling a dying beast, waiting to see who would seize power after his death. And yet, Henry clung to his throne with iron claws. He demanded obedience. He thundered against his enemies. He still wielded the axe of fear, even as his body betrayed him. By the end of 1546, the King of England was trapped in pain, trapped in paranoia, and trapped in a decaying body that reeked of death. His court whispered, "The lion is dying." But Henry refused to admit it. What followed would be weeks of unbearable suffering, political conspiracies, and a death so foul that it shocked even hardened courtiers. The year is 1546, and King Henry VIII sits upon his gilded throne at Whitehall. But the grandeur of the crown could no longer disguise the prison of flesh in which he lived. Henry's once celebrated body, famed across Europe for its athleticism and charm, had become a grotesque symbol of decline. Chroniclers describe him as an enormous mass of unhealthy flesh, so heavy that custom-made chairs and reinforced beds had to be built to bear his weight. He could no longer ride a horse into battle or even walk unaided across the length of a hall. The leg wound from his jousting accident 3 decades earlier had turned into a living curse. Ulcers festered, refusing to heal. Surgeons lanced and drained them daily, releasing a stench so foul that courtiers covered their noses and physicians gagged. Chronic infection filled the air with decay, and rumors spread that the king's very body was rotting while he still breathed. Some modern historians suspect Henry may have suffered from type 2 diabetes, Cushing's syndrome, or severe gout. Whatever the cause, his suffering was evident. The king's body swelled with edema, his ankles ballooned, and his joints burned with pain so fierce that he could scarcely sleep. He often lashed out at servants or counselors, erupting in rage at the slightest mistake, a tyrant made worse by agony. Yet Henry's appetites did not diminish. He consumed mountains of roasted meat, pies, and puddings, washed down with goblets of strong ale and red wine. Court accounts reveal that even in his final months, he gorged on banquets fit for 20 men. Doctors begged him to moderate, but Henry, ever the autocrat, sneered at their advice. His gluttony fed the very disease that was killing him. But perhaps most haunting was the smell. Eyewitnesses wrote that the odor of Henry's body was unbearable. His festering sores leaked onto his bedding, soiling the palace with corruption. Servants whispered that the king was cursed, rotting alive for the sins of his soul, a man who had torn apart Christendom, beheaded wives, and drowned his kingdom in blood. Despite his agony, Henry refused to appear weak. He still demanded audiences, still commanded wars, still summoned courtiers to kneel before him. He had ramps built to move him between rooms, and when he traveled, he was carried in elaborate chairs or wheeled about in massive contraptions. Even so, his subjects could not ignore the truth. The once golden prince was now a monster of flesh, decaying in public view. The king who once embodied power and majesty had become a grotesque figure, swollen, stinking, and raging against the dying of his body. And as his physical decline worsened, so too did his fears of betrayal, his obsession with enemies both real and imagined. The body of Henry VIII was collapsing, and with it, the fragile stability of England trembled. As Henry's body failed, his mind grew ever more suspicious. The dying king was surrounded not by comfort, but by whispers of power, inheritance, and betrayal. The court of 1546 was a nest of vipers. Protestant reformers and Catholic traditionalists circled like wolves, each hoping to influence the sickly monarch before the end. Whoever controlled Henry's will would control the future of England. Henry trusted no one fully. He eyed his sixth wife, Catherine Parr, with suspicion, despite her loyalty. He remembered the fate of Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, both executed by his own hand, and wondered if Parr, too, might betray him. Even his beloved children, Edward, Mary, and Elizabeth, became pawns in his fevered imagination, as factions schemed to secure their succession. At night, Henry raged in his chamber, haunted by visions of those he had condemned. Some said he muttered the names of Anne Boleyn and Thomas More in his sleep, as if their ghosts demanded vengeance. Others claimed he wept for Jane Seymour, the only wife he truly loved, whose death in childbirth left a scar on his soul. By January 1547, fear ruled Whitehall. Servants tiptoed, counselors whispered, and everyone waited for the inevitable moment when the king's fury, paranoia, and failing body would finally collapse into death. As Henry's death drew closer, one question overshadowed all others: who would rule after him? His heir, Prince Edward, was only 9 years old, frail, pale, and far too young to wear a crown alone. This made the stakes deadly. Powerful men at court, the Seymours, the Dudleys, and the Howards, plotted to seize control of the regency. Each faction whispered into Henry's ear, urging him to favor their side. The king, bloated and feverish, clutched at his last authority. In December 1546, he revised his will, a document that could decide the fate of England. He demanded strict obedience to his wishes, yet everyone knew that once he was gone, the vultures would feast. Even as he rotted alive, Henry clung to power with a trembling hand. He still thundered that he was God's anointed king. But behind the palace doors, his counselors were already preparing for a kingdom without him. The end was near, and with it, a dangerous game of succession began. Despite his failing body, Henry refused to live like a dying man. In his final weeks, he demanded banquets, mountains of roasted boar, swans, venison pies, and goblets of red wine. Courtiers forced smiles as they dined, but behind their masks of loyalty, many were sickened by the spectacle. The king could barely lift food to his mouth. Servants had to cut his meat, wipe his chin, and carry away trays of half-eaten feasts. Yet Henry gorged on, ignoring the ulcers rotting his legs and the pus soaking his bandages. Doctors warned him, priests cautioned moderation, but the king snarled, "I am Henry, by the grace of God, I will eat as I please." The stench of disease mingled with the smell of roasted flesh, turning his chambers into a grotesque parody of courtly splendor. Those closest to him whispered that even his appetite had become a curse, feeding the very body that was killing him. The last feast of Henry VIII was not a celebration of life, but a macabre performance, a king devouring himself as death waited at the door. By January 1547, Henry VIII's body was breaking apart faster than his willpower could conceal. He was confined almost entirely to bed at Whitehall Palace, surrounded by the stink of gangrene and festering sores. His enormous weight pressed down on him like a coffin lid, and every movement caused agony. Physicians tried everything they knew, poultices of herbs, ointments of honey and vinegar, and even heated irons to burn away the rot. Nothing worked. The ulcers on his legs swelled and split, spilling pus and blood until servants gagged as they cleaned his sheets. The great King of England lay trapped in filth. Yet even as his body rotted, Henry's voice thundered. Courtiers trembled to approach him, for he still erupted in fury at imagined slights. He cursed his counselors, threatened his physicians, and barked commands as though armies still marched at his will. No one dared whisper "death" in his presence. The law made it treason to predict the king's end. But everyone knew the truth. Henry himself must have felt it too. His face was pale and bloated, his breath shallow and foul. He prayed more often, clinging to priests for comfort, haunted by sins that no crown could erase. Did he fear meeting Anne Boleyn in the afterlife? Did the screams of Catherine Howard echo in his ears? No record can prove it, yet his restless prayers suggest a king tormented by the ghosts of his past. As his final hours drew near, his chamber fell silent except for the labored wheezing of a dying monarch. England's future balanced on every breath, for once Henry was gone, the boy King Edward would inherit a throne swarmed by ambitious wolves. The most powerful man in Europe was reduced to a broken body, drowning in his own stench, waiting for the shadow of death. As the end closed in, priests were summoned to Henry's bedside. The king, once too proud to kneel before any pope, now begged for God's mercy. He clutched at the crucifix, muttering prayers, his swollen lips trembling with fear. Yet even in confession, he avoided naming his sins. He did not speak of Anne Boleyn's execution, nor Catherine Howard's screams, nor the thousands who died under his command. Instead, he sought absolution in vague words, as if God would overlook the rivers of blood he had spilled. Those present noted his terror. This was no peaceful passing. This was a king frightened of the judgment waiting beyond the grave. Henry VIII, who once defied the Church of Rome, now begged for forgiveness from the God he had tried to command. On the night of January 27, 1547, Henry's breaths grew shallow, rattling like broken bellows. His courtiers stood frozen, afraid to speak the word everyone knew: the king was dying. At around 2 a.m., Henry VIII exhaled his final breath. No thunder shook the sky, no angels sang, only silence. The most feared monarch in English history, who had ruled with iron and fire for 37 years, was gone. But even in death, fear lingered. The courtiers dared not announce it at once. It was treason to declare the king dead without certainty, so they waited hours, watching his corpse swell, before whispering the truth: the lion has fallen. Henry VIII, once golden prince, now rotting tyrant, died not on the battlefield, but in his own stench, alone and broken. The death of Henry VIII in January 1547 did not bring immediate peace to England. Instead, it unleashed a storm of secrecy, fear, and ambition. For more than 2 days, his death was hidden from the public. Courtiers whispered in locked chambers, uncertain how to proceed, while the king's massive corpse began to swell and blacken. Servants lit heavy candles to mask the stench that grew stronger with each passing hour. Henry's body was eventually encased in a lead-lined coffin, yet even that could not contain the corruption within. Chroniclers later claimed that as his coffin was transported, it began to leak foul fluids, so much that dogs lapped at the blood and pus seeping onto the floor. Whether fact or rumor, the story spread quickly. England's mighty king, who had torn apart Christendom, was rotting even in death. But while his body decayed, the battle for power erupted among the living. His heir, Prince Edward VI, was only 9 years old, a pale, sickly boy who could barely hold the weight of a crown. He would rule in name only. Real power fell into the hands of his uncle, Edward Seymour, who styled himself Lord Protector. Others, like John Dudley and Thomas Wriothesley, maneuvered for influence, already plotting how to use the boy king for their own advantage. For Henry's daughters, the future was uncertain. Mary, the devout Catholic, saw her chance to restore Rome's influence one day. Elizabeth, daughter of the beheaded Anne Boleyn, played a quieter game, watching and waiting. Both knew that their fates hung on fragile alliances and the dangerous tides of politics. The people of England received the news with a mix of awe and dread. Henry VIII had been feared more than loved, but his presence had been absolute. His death left a void, and with it, questions that threatened the kingdom's stability. Would Edward survive long enough to rule? Would civil war break out between Catholic and Protestant factions? Would the ghosts of Henry's decisions drag England into chaos? At Whitehall, the funeral preparations matched the king's monstrous legacy. Thousands marched in procession, clad in black, while his coffin, heavy, bloated with corruption, was carried toward Windsor. Priests prayed, trumpets sounded, and the people bowed. But beneath the pageantry, many whispered that England was well rid of him. One chronicler, centuries later, would write, "He spared no man in his life, and in his death, no man mourned him." Perhaps harsh, but it reflected the truth of a reign built on fear and blood. Henry VIII's final days had been a spectacle of rot, stench, and paranoia. His death was no less grotesque. And in his absence, England stepped nervously into a new era, one ruled by a child, haunted by the shadow of a tyrant. Henry VIII left behind more than a crown. He left scars on England's soul. 6 wives, 2 beheaded, a church torn from Rome, monasteries destroyed, thousands executed. And yet, despite all his power, his end was not glorious. He died in filth, rotting from within, abandoned by strength, haunted by ghosts, and remembered as a king who devoured his own kingdom as surely as he devoured himself. The once golden Prince of England became a legend of corruption, fear, and decay, a warning that even the mightiest kings cannot escape death's judgment. And that was the horrific final chapter of King Henry VIII, rotting alive in his own stench. If you enjoyed this dark journey through history, make sure to subscribe to Royal Conspiracies, give this video a like, and share it with those who love the secrets of the past. Because here, every crown has a curse, and every throne hides a conspiracy.